Welcome to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. Join us as we share our favorite RPGs, one-shot games, tabletop games, reviews, and convention panels. Sit back and enjoy the show.
Hi, this is Kelly, aka Trixie from Ragnarok and Roll, a Sign to Ragnarok story, and Tilda Wimblewick from D&D Journey of the 5th Edition. First off, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for listening to our varied adventures, as well as for rating us on iTunes and rpgpodcast.com. If you haven't rated us yet, we would greatly appreciate it if you could. And if you're looking for more ways to support our efforts, we are now on Patreon, a great site where you can help us continue making more podcasts, as well as some special surprises for our patrons. If you can, please look us up at www.patreon.com/cppn. Every little bit helps. And again, thank you for listening.
I guess we'll get started since I've got 5 o'clock on my watch. This is Would a Phaser by Any Other Name Still Goes At? Which, naming made-up names in science fiction and fantasy.
Made-up names for made-up
technology. My name's Bruce Davis. I am an author of both science fiction and fantasy. I'm with Brick Cave Media, publisher out of Mesa. Books are available over there in the dealer's room at Mostly Books. If anyone would like to pick one up, that would be greatly appreciated. In my day job, I'm a trauma surgeon, and I've been a science fiction and fantasy fan for as long as I can read. So, but these lovely ladies, take it away.
I'm Catherine Wells. I am also an author of science fiction, novels and short stories. I have a new book out this year, Crystal Desert, and I wish I could show you a copy, but as I said, I managed to walk out of the house without my bag of books. Catch me tomorrow. I'll have ones that you can have a look at.
And by default, this is Gloria.
Hello, I'm Gloria McMillan, and I'm not a writer of science fiction. I'm a dramatist, and I'm going to have our play done tomorrow. And I'm also an artist and cartoonist, and I will be giving away some of my Glow's Adventures in Rat Lab Land cartoons. If you don't like the book I edited several years ago about Ray Bradbury, you can have the cartoons, and I also have reproductions of my Decalcomania art that was inspired by our guest of honor last year, Alan Clark, who's a master of that.
So, I'm not real sure where to go with this panel.
Well, I am.
I'm sure you are, Gloria.
Lots of places to go.
So, there's been a very long tradition of made-up technology with made-up names in science fiction. And I guess the first question is, should we have some conventions for doing that? Or should we just kind of make them up?
Well, I don't think you could enforce any conventions. We could try to establish some, but getting this many writers to abide by them, I think is kind of like trying to nail Jello to the wall.
Well, maybe I should rephrase that then. Do you have personal conventions in terms of how you name things?
I have a personal philosophy. I try to use combinations of words, pieces of words that the reader will recognize and associate with something related to the technology. If I have basically a robot that is guarding the border, I call it a Surbot, a surveillance robot. So it's a Surbot. So I try to use pieces of things that are recognizable.
Well, that makes sense. I'm more in the area of academia and semantics, so I think that it's important to have things that in some way recognize the power of words to create reality. And when you're giving things names, that's a terrible power. If you've read Ray Bradbury's The Naming of Names story, it's a short story about the Earthlings being very egregious and naming everything after themselves on Mars, that, this will come up in your stories, the naming of things. So part of it's technology, but part of it is just who gets to make up the names half creates the reality. And I'm looking at it from a different angle than just naming this and that and how they're named.
Well, that's a good point, though, because by choosing particular names, as you alluded to, you inform the function of whatever it is that you're doing. But you can also create kind of a social convention for your world, so that, I'm thinking the old THX 1138, where the most human-looking characters in there are the security robots.
Right.
Which is just a huge telling contrast. Because they're adopting postures and poses that you would associate with humans, and all the humans are walking around robotically.
Oh, yeah. I haven't seen that for a while.
I use conventions like you alluded to in my fiction, where a robot that unloads cargo is just simply a cargo bot. You name it for what it does. But when you start getting into technology, like in my Prophet books, I have a gravity drive. Well, I don't name it anything fancy. I call it a Moss drive because that's the guy who invented it. So you can get into all kinds of weird stuff if you want to follow some rule of using the function or the physics, like phaser. I don't know what phaser is supposed to mean other than photons. But
he wanted to use laser, but laser wouldn't do what he had this doing.
Right.
So he just changed the
first
phony.
I would like to broaden this out and not stick at the level of trees in the forest. The original robot was in RUR by Karl Čapek in 1920. And we could call things Joe Friendly Bot, and they could be killers. Because we live in a world of misleading names, ad agencies, Madison Avenue, Mad Men, who name things. And we're getting into an age where we have AI, which can be used, yes, as Joe Friendly Bot, but Joe Friendly Bot also has all these appliances which could make him Joe Killer Bot by his thousands in war. So, this is going to be a problem because things can be named very deceptively in terms of what their functions are. I just watched the Chinese World Robotics, China World Robots, or whatever it's called, Expo. And it's like a 20-minute video. And they have the smiling faces. They look like Chinese poets with long, flowing hair. But then they showed the little dogs that can flip over, and they said, and last year we had 100 of them doing it all at once. And I thought, oh yeah. And they could have these nails which can go right into you with inject whatever. Just like the mechanical hound did in Fahrenheit 451. So if you call it Joe Friendly Bot, is it Joe Friendly Bot?
So I have a question just kind of to feed off of that. I mean, writers, since there have been writers, have loved that dichotomy of naming things that way. I mean, that's almost a literary tool. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that I would say that's a cautionary tale. That's like a tool of the trade.
Robots in Rosum, they were named robots because that was a helpful serf-like being that wouldn't cost you any money to feed or,
Is it the root of that in Czech, slave?
Something like that,
yeah.
Servant.
It's a Slavic.
Serf labor.
Yeah. But that's just the point. That has since been adopted as a convention for something that is an semi-autonomous or autonomous machine. Whatever it does. Whether it's Joe Friendly Bot or whether it's Evil Kill You Bot. I mean, look at Murderbot. Murderbot is called Murderbot, but is it really Murderbot?
Yes.
She is.
Well, yeah,
call it that.
But no.
Conflicted Murderbot.
No, she named herself that, right? But anyway, yeah. So good. So what I was going to say is it also depends on, like, when you're writing, is the technology, is the story about the technology, then you want to give it probably some interesting different name. But if you're just using the technology as the tool to move your story forward, it's a teleporter. They needed to go to this other planet to do the thing. So you don't necessarily need to give it an interesting name.
It depends
and it's
on
not integral to the story.
It depends on how you're utilizing that tool. If it's just everybody has one and we're using it, it doesn't need it actually probably should have a trade name or what we would associate with trade names, because that's the world you're in. On the other hand, if you're the guy who's inventing it, and that's the focus of the story, you're going to have a whole lot different level of detail and naming conventions.
Or if it's a war, and the troops on all sides are autonomous weapons, and they can be called many things. They can have many trade names or brand names. But this is a thing facing us. You could have an army of autonomous drones, and they could be called buzzy bees, friendly buzzy bees.
Well, but whatever you call them, they're going to be, that word, whatever you choose.
See, that's the whole title of our panel.
Is going to be associated with whatever function they fulfill. So if you call them friendly buzzy bees and they start killing things, friendly buzzy bee is all now not a friendly name.
No, and people are going to name it something else, whether you want them to or not.
If you call it security forces, and what they really do is oppress people, security force doesn't mean security anymore.
No.
And we've seen that time and again. Yeah. So I think you're drawing a somewhat artificial distinction there.
No, I don't think it's an artificial distinction, because it goes back to Shakespeare and rose by any other name. That hasn't been solved. Maybe you think that's been solved, but I don't think
that's
it's
not that. It's not anything to be solved. I think it means that names can be arbitrary.
Names can be intentionally misleading, and then sometimes if the busy buzzy bees become a buzzword, no pun intended, then they will change to another innocuous name, and it will keep going to stay one step ahead of people, so that they will keep thinking that these are not so. I mean, I'm just giving a caution. I'm allowed to do this on this panel. I'm giving the cautionary point of view, whereas it's the whole capitalist thing is to say, and even in China now they're so capitalist. Oh, these are wonderful. Look, they can be like our poets, and all I'm thinking from my years of reading science fiction. Oh yeah, just like the Mechanical Hound and Fahrenheit 451.
So why would that be a cautionary tale for writers?
Yeah, perhaps I'm misinterpreting.
Like, why is it?
What we're doing on this panel?
You're making it sound like writers should not be doing that.
No, I'm saying that these words have terrible power to mislead. And many things are censored by omission, and things are named to be purposely misleading. And what we're saying at the beginning is, well, yeah, we'll just give them these nice transparent names, because language is just a clear window through which we view things. Well, language is not a clear window.
But even Shakespeare
but that's not even what I said.
Misleading language.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, he literally used misinterpretation and misleading language to propel his stories.
If you're telling a story and you're going to make up a name and you have it be a misleading name, then that better be an intent in your story.
And I'm sure it will be. Because if you're going to that extent to make up a deceptive plot point, then that probably is leading to something.
It should. If it isn't, then you've wasted your time.
I think most writers
you need to rewrite your story.
Just do that for no reason. And we have plenty of examples of people who do put in misleading names for a good reason. In fact, Rossum's Universal Robots was initially a very benign name, but it became known as something else as time went on and people were being culled because they weren't, meatware wasn't worth its keep. A lot of people are very concerned about these things. So, this dapper, some of our toys and our tropes are becoming real in the real, I don't know if that's fair to say real world, but the mundane world.
But as writers, if you're going to imagine or make up a device, a technique, whatever, and you're going to name it something, you choose the name based on the intent of the story. Like, if you just need to get from point A to point B, it's just a teleporter, whereas If it's an evil teleporter, you might add something else in there. If you're going to choose a very benign, very misleading name, and then the point of your story is that that's a misleading name, that's the point of the story. That's why you chose it. If I'm going to say, friendly robot who's going to go out and kill people as opposed to murderbot who's going to go out and kill people, that has to have a different point of the story.
And that's a reflection on who makes the name, who has the power to name things, and what kind of a society it is in your story.
Of course, yes. But that was the point I made earlier on. When you name something,
I agree with that point you made earlier on.
When you name something in your story, you either choose it for just technical reasons, or it informs the social background that you're working in. We kind of left you out of this, Kathy.
Well, it went in a direction that I was unprepared for. So,
I was totally prepared for it.
Yeah, I can tell.
You can tell, yes.
But when it comes to naming technology, I think the point we need to take from this is that consider who in your story did the naming.
Exactly.
Is it just the name that people call it by, that the common man calls it by? Is it the name the manufacturer gave to it? Is it the name the ad company gave to it? Those are things that you consider. As I mentioned earlier, with the phaser, Roddenberry didn't want to say laser because you can't put a laser on stun. These things are supposed to do things that lasers,
don't do.
You shoot a laser, and where does it end? Okay, it just keeps going. But so he just changed the first phoneme, but people knew from the sound of it that it was going to be some kind of weapon. That was his intent in choosing that.
I don't know enough Star Trek lore to know if phaser then informed photon torpedo.
Well, even within, even within Star Trek, one race uses phaser, one race uses disruptor, and they both make things go blow up, and they get fired.
So it becomes kind of a moot point. If you start writing or getting into military science fiction, and you get a lot of acronyms and the military loves their acronyms if they can then run into a fake word.
Could I interject?
Every day of my working life.
Then we have the issue of AI, and when it's combined with Joe Friendly Bot. And many people are very concerned about what they call AI, and I think it's mislabeled. And I think science fiction writers have gotten it more correct in many of their stories than what's out there. Everything is AI. Your toaster is AI. Your shoes are AI. And are they really AI because we're calling them AI? No, they're not. AI is something that actually has very high sophisticated qualities of being a sentient self-awareness. And most of these things are totally human programmed, even the so-called autonomous drones. So AI is very worrisome to people. It's become almost it's across the whole culture. Everybody is talking about AI is going to eat your grandma's knickers, and it's a very scary concept. But what we have is not AI. So I think that misleading names can cause a lot of disruption, whether in fact or in fiction.
Well, they're supposed to in fiction.
Not
if you're
always.
putting a misleading name in fiction, you better be creating disruption. That's the point.
Not always. That the misleading
So
names.
help us understand where it does. You're talking as though fiction writers have to be a certain level of representation in their writing in regards to what they name technology.
No.
Talk to me about a writer that doesn't do that, or somewhere where
That isn't what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there are things out in society that are the buzzwords of any given time. We call it the rhetorical situation of any given time. And AI right now is one of these. And science fiction has dealt with it, but what the public who don't read science fiction, I think, have a very different, more misled idea.
But we're talking
of what AI
about
is.
writers creating names, not about what the public perceives as our current reality.
So, a couple of things. So one, from what you're saying, so AI is something that science fiction has been poking at for since Turing for a long time. The sentient machine, which is basically a silicon-based life form, is able to make decisions on its own. It doesn't need to be programmed. It can figure things out from scratch, which came long before. And AI as a marketing tool is a much catchier name than to actually tell people that it's not AI, it's just a super duper guesser. Because that's what current AI is.
Or advanced machine learning.
Right, but basically it's not even learning, it's actually just, it's what they call heuristics, it's advanced guessing. Mm-hmm. So you load it up and it looks for patterns. Because machines right now excel at identifying patterns. I'm in medicine, you're in medicine. One of the things we look at in medicine with AI coming out is what they call treatment bundles. Mm-hmm. So I take and I load all information on all the patients I have, everything. Their height, their men, which way they dress, their sexual orientation, their income, their stress level, the whole kit caboodle, and all their diagnoses and outcomes and drugs they ever got. And then I got this huge database. Then you present, and I say, oh look, here is Glow. Glow has this disease state, and it goes back and looks for everybody that matches you, or as close as possible, looks at all the possible permutations that it's got examples of, and says the people who match Glow most closely, who had this disease state, got this particular treatment sequence, achieved the best outcomes, and it says, I suggest you treat Glow with this, based on the depth of the data. So it's just really good guessers. So there's the naming thing with marketing, right? And I'm in drugs. So let me tell you, I don't know who makes up the names of pharmaceuticals.
I think it's a Scrabble set. And they just
X's in a Scrabble set.
I think we're losing what point I was actually making, but that was very, very
right. So you can deliberately give something a friendly name because you want to basically disarm people from worrying about what would happen if it got misused.
Right.
So a drone can fly around and do things. You can attach things onto a drone. So it's just right. It sits there. It's just a drone, right? I'm going to give it a nice, friendly name. And I want people to think about the fact that somebody could, with a couple solenoids, put a single shot or multiple shot weapon on it and go out there and basically snipe people.
Which is exactly what they do.
On the flip side, you can use things to be fun to move a story along. A good example is Stargate, right? Teal has a name for that guy, and I can't pronounce it. It's in the language. And O'Neill just goes, Zapka. Right? He hears the name a couple of times, he can't pronounce it, he just says, that's a Zapka. That's a Zapka.
Because it zaps.
Right, because it zaps. And it's a fun kind of play because Teal'c is very formal and he always calls it by appropriate name, and it fits their personality. So in a way, it's a play on names. So sometimes you just have to make up a name. It's even more as a made-up technology. It doesn't even exist, and so you got a made-up technology, a made-up thing that uses it.
Okay, but my point was something a little bit different than that. It's that you create panic when you're giving something like AI to the public and acting as though it already exists and it's going to eat your grandma's Snickers and all those other bad things, when it doesn't actually exist. What we have is advanced machine learning, and it's far from being HAL in 2001. And some of the things that would be AI.
So the question is...
But it's, wait, because I finished my sentence. It's that this kind of naming is important. That goes back to the title of the panel. Would it still zap if it was called something else? And what societal effect would it be if we call things by a name that isn't what they are, but that instills huge hysteria in the public, like AI is doing? Because the words have create what isn't there.
No, names are important. Names give things meaning and definition.
But whatever you called that phaser, it's an object that would still do the same thing.
Yeah, if you want to call it toe, I mean,
it still does that same thing. So yes, you're right. You can mislead and
you can create panic in
false
the public.
impressions by
panic.
how you name things.
Right.
But the question is, does the naming convention in your writing, not in what I'm putting out there for public consumption or not what I'm actually meaning, in your writing matter? And I think we've already alluded to it. It may matter if it's a plot point.
Yes.
If it's simply a tool, hand me the thingamajig so I can tighten this thermostat, who cares?
Well, that's taking what the topic of this panel is in the most literal and very narrow sense. because that isn't what I thought the panel was going to be about. I thought it was going to be about, will things act as though they were something they are not just because they are called that name?
Well, I didn't get that out of it.
Naming made-up items in science fiction and fantasy, it's pretty clear.
Because of rhetoric, and my field being rhetoric, and it's very important what you call things in rhetoric, and if it's
and in real world applications, I would totally agree. Words have meaning,
and in real
we should
fictional
be.
applications too.
I think in fictional applications, yes, words matter, but they matter as part of story.
Yeah, and in the naming
And
of
in
names,
that sense, they
that
are
does
the
matter.
choice of the author.
Right, like in Bradbury, where the naming of names, and that's a fantastic story dealing with precisely what I'm talking about. The people who have the power to name things create a new situation where that is what that mountain is now. It's that name.
So your tone suggests that that's a bad thing.
Well, it depends on who's doing the naming, who has the power of naming.
But as a writer,
It's not so much the word itself. The word could be grizzable. It's who has the power to call things certain things.
so
and then
does
sticks.
that determine whether it's good or bad? The person that has the power.
It depends
I'm not sure
what-
I'm understanding. I think
Have you
what's
read
happening
Ray
here.
Bradbury by any chance?
What's happening here is you're telling us something, but you're not giving us the complete end point.
Okay,
Like,
well,
why
I'm
does
trying
it
to
matter?
tell you that names are very important, and
Absolutely.
that the people who have the power to name things, or people, or groups of people, and make those names stick and make those qualities stick, it's
Okay.
very.
To what
So-
end? What is the end point of that? Like, are you
The
suggesting
end
that they
point
shouldn't?
is talking
or-
about the power of rhetoric and semantics. That words are very important. They have to create reality.
Okay.
Which is what we do as
Within
authors all the
stories,
time.
yeah,
Right.
in not always good ways. And we usually take this in such a routine way of, I'm going to call this a gribzop because it's a gribzop, you know. There are many different ways that names reflect power situations, and the people being named, or robots, whatever are being named, certain things, may not match the names.
I think
Or
most writers are very much aware of that,
I think
if-
you're right.
if not just intuitively. If I'm going to give something a name and it has importance in the world building or the story, or implies something about the people who created the name, I'm going to pick a certain type of name. If I'm just going to have a fancy wrench, I'll just call it a fancy wrench. You know, I mean, like the one we made earlier.
Screwdriver?
A sonic screwdriver. A sonic screwdriver. We're getting way, you know, I mean, a multi-tool.
Yeah.
What the hell is a multi-tool?
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I can make it do anything I want. Because it's a multi-tool.
Well, that's because
whereas,
you have the power of making it a multi-tool,
Exactly.
because you're the king of your society.
Whereas if I'm naming the animals on a planet that I've colonized, and I call a particular thing a jumpin' Jiminy, well, that's going to give you an implication about what it is. But what if I tell you a jumpin' Jiminy is actually a pack-hunting carnivorous kangaroo? Now they're scary things.
I have a scary story for you. Ray Bradbury was very against colonizing. He really ridiculed it in the Martian Chronicles and the naming of names, especially that chapter. And so what did NASA do? Anybody know what the punchline is of this one? For the Curiosity rover, what did NASA do? Anybody? Don't remember, huh? Okay, they named the landing part. Isn't that right, Bob? Is it Curiosity where they named the landing area Bradbury? They did. Despite this whole...
Yeah.
They gotta name it something.
Now, come on, it's this whole career.
We don't have Martians to
Didn't
consult,
believe
so we
that-
gotta name it
Because you
something.
can take every mountain in the Southwest and rename it after a gringo, so, and that was kind of the model for Mars. But, the naming, and he was so adamant about that. And so what did they do? They went and named the landing. And it was a friend of mine who's a science fiction fan said, well, come on, Glow, there you go again. She said, well, of course now what saves it is we know that there are no previous civilizations on Mars. If they are, they're only at the level of a paramecium, and they probably didn't call that landing area much of anything. Now that's an inference, maybe they did.
But you're saying that that was something inappropriate that they did.
Oh yes, very.
Do you know that they did it to be intentionally inappropriate?
Oh no, they didn't. They just hadn't read Bradbury, which is very embarrassing for NASA, I think.
Not necessarily.
I know.
Not necessarily.
What are they going to call it? They got to call it something.
Well, they don't have to call it after someone who didn't like things on Mars being named after Earth people, like Bradbury. They could have named it somebody else. So these naming conventions are extremely important, and within fiction as well, and as that story, the naming of names. The other one is, "And the moon be still as bright." Have you all read that?
I don't know, they ladies don't have to be, that'd be pretty cool.
That's the one where the one astronaut goes native and he gets very angry because Biggs is throwing bottles into the canal in Bradbury.
Oh, yeah.
And says, "I dubbed the Biggs Canal or Briggs Canal." In the story it's Biggs and in the movie it's Briggs. But so this one astronaut he's getting the vibes of the previous people. And it upsets him so much to watch this drunken astronaut throwing all these bottles into the canal and naming it after himself. So naming is very important. And who does it and why in fiction. And that was fiction. That wasn't fact. That was
But
Martian
the
Chronicles.
point of that was exactly the point you made.
Yeah.
It was a plot point.
It was the important plot point.
The conflict between the two characters based on their behavior and the fact that this guy
And
was
not just
behaving
that.
badly.
Not just that, Bradbury was into general semantics, and he had written a previous story called Referent about a little boy in a colony of genius boys who are being raised by semanticists. This was a big movement. It's sort of, I don't know what the equivalent movement is today, but it was a big movement in post-World War II, where people talked more carefully, S.I. Hayakawa, language in action. If we talked more accurately, we wouldn't have new wars because we wouldn't be misapplying terrible labels and buzzwords just willy-nilly at a high level of abstraction. So Heinlein was influenced by it, Philip K. Dick, Bradbury, of course A.E. Van Vogt. They were all influenced by it, and it all had to do with naming of names and the importance of language half creating reality. And so this story, and you can get it at Project Gutenberg, it's called Referent by Ray Bradbury, where this little boy meets up with a being who comes to wherever this planet is. He's being trained, as these genius kids are, to be the perfect semantics people. And this thing can change into anything, because if you know semantics, it's the ultimate referent. The signs are the labels we put on things, and the referent is the thing that's being labeled. And so it keeps changing its shape every time someone looks at it and labels it, because this is the power of naming.
Has anybody got a favorite device or sonic screwdriver that is made up?
I think some of the best made up technology was by Optimus, the Levinston series.
Yeah.
It's a lavender.
Yeah, but again, they're names that imply certain functions, but they don't tell you what it does or how it works.
But still, it's really, the technology is like a space opera. So it's just fun to read because of all the fantastic technology and other things. But it's like a major adventure story, so you accept it as part of the world's.
As part of the world's background.
Right. But
Naturalized.
Like another one is the hyperspanner.
Yeah.
It sounds like a cool multi-tool kind of thing that must do whatever you need.
And my favorite's from Hitchhiker's Guide, the Killer Zap.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, that does what it does exactly what it says it will do.
Battlefish.
Battlefish was good because that was language. Yeah, it was very good. The instant comprehension of anyone's language. And that's the black box we use in all science fiction, because most people in science fiction are not interested in linguistics. So we make them all telepaths or use some kind of black box.
Universal translator.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but again, you don't have to explain how it works. It just works. How does the Heisenberg compensator work? Very well, thank you.
And there's 3 pages of data dump.
Any points to make, Catherine?
Well, I think the point that we draw is that naming is important. It
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah.
It matters if you call it a phaser or a laser. You don't want to call it a laser because that is not consistent with what the thing does.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because if you're going to either extrapolate technology or invent new technology, you don't necessarily want to name it after something that we already know very well how it should behave.
Yeah.
And then make it behave radically different.
And another thing is when you do invent a name for your technology, please Google it and make sure it isn't already invented.
Somebody already made that thing up.
Or that it isn't already used for something else.
Yes, yeah. I have written this whole book with the VT aircraft, the VT something, and I thought maybe I should check and see if there is an aircraft called.
Or that it isn't a rude word in some other language. Very bad word.
So I remember, how many years ago was it when they used to have the billboards here in Tucson that said Skynet?
Yes.
That
Oh,
was about the
yeah.
weather, right?
Yeah.
The Weather Channel. I was
Oh,
like,
yeah.
do you not watch movies? Do you not know what you just did there?
I still see that on occasion.
Oh, really?
It's like,
Okay.
okay, guys.
That's hilarious.
Either you're intentionally going there, which you may well be, or you missed the reference. Which gets into this whole business of cultural reference.
Right.
What may be acceptable in one culture or in one time is no longer acceptable or may be offensive in a different culture. And so, yeah, you have to be a little bit careful with your naming conventions and with colloquialisms that you may throw into your dialogue. I think especially if you're writing science fiction, you got to be kind of careful not to keep it too close to what we use today because it becomes obsolete so fast.
Well, yeah.
Well, what do you think of the NADSAT language in Clockwork Orange?
I think it's dated. It no longer resonates.
It doesn't?
I don't think it does. No, I read Clockwork Orange recently, and it's all
But why is
Clockwork
that?
Orange.
because it was written in a very
Certain rhetorical situation?
no, it's kind of it has to do with the time that the book was written and references
That's what
to
I'm
the
talking
Soviet
about.
Union
That's what we call
that
it.
no longer are referent now.
In our
So I
field,
find
we
it
call
very
that a
dated,
rhetorical
quite-
situation.
I find it very dated, and I don't think it works anymore. You have to read it with that in mind and understand where it came from. Otherwise,
So why
it's like,
is it dated? I mean, the Russian words are still the same, and they're just smushed
but if
together.
they're no longer relevant
Relevant to what?
to where the culture
We're kind
today.
of in a Cold War situation now. I would think it's more relevant than ever.
Well, I don't find it that way. I found it dated. I found that some of the things that they were emphasizing. It would be more current, I think, if those words were Korean.
Could it be updated then to the current Cold War that we're in?
Well, why would it? It's
Because
written at a
it's-
specific time for a
We're in
specific
another
nation.
one. Why can't we update it?
Then why would you update somebody else's work?
No, I mean another sequel. We're endlessly doing sequels. We have franchise sequels.
I don't think that's a good thing.
Then you're
Yeah.
departing from the world that was created for that book. Books are not reality. Books are oftentimes, even though they may be speculative, anchored in a particular time and place. You read a lot of Heinlein stuff, and it just doesn't resonate anymore.
That's why a lot of Gibson stuff continues to evolve.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't have to say I don't like it.
I mean, you can go back to
No, it
current
does
authors
move
and
forward, yeah.
compare early work with current work
I have
and
another-
see the evolution.
I'm sorry. I have another
Terminologies.
question about Clockwork Orange. Was it about the language, or was that just a trope and it was about something else? Was it more about conditioning people so they didn't have
That's what
freedom?
it was about. I'm saying
But was the
that,
language a major part of it?
yes, I thought it was, because it was building the world of these gangs. And it was very much a part of their world, but for me, it no longer resonated the way it did when I first read the book
I'm
in the
not following
70s.
what you mean by resonate.
It sounded dated to me, to my ear, listening as I'm reading.
But other things are older and they're not current, and yet they still, as you term it, resonate with people.
Because it depends on the genre. It depends on the point of the story. If you're taking a gang and with their own special language and you're creating this language for them to speak, which is current for them, but the intent is to be referent to things going on in the world around you, which is what was intended there.
So you think there is no coercive behavioral modification going on anymore?
I never said anything like that. I
That's
said
what
I
it
found
sounds
the
like.
language
So let me
dated.
turn it around
That's all.
and ask you
Yeah.
if everything that you read 40 or 50 years ago is exactly
I
the
wouldn't
same.
make a
to you.
generalization.
Let me finish.
But you just
Yeah.
made a
If everything
generalization
you
of
read
what I
40 or
just
said.
asked
50
you a
years
question.
ago is exactly the same to you as it is when you read it.
I would say I wouldn't generalize, first of all, and I would take each thing separately. And I have a different, there isn't one reading, and every person reads a different novel when they're reading a novel. So
the answer to the question is?
that it's reader response theory, it's called.
So
Yeah.
Bruce isn't allowed to have
I
different reader
just said
responses.
everybody who reads
Is
it.
that
reads
kind of what you're trying to
No, you're
position here? 'Cause
misreading
you're
my
baiting
words.
him.
Let me explain. For me, it is not irrelevant or obsolete. For him, it is.
Right.
And my theory that I'm dealing with is called reader response theory, which is that he has a right to have it be not resonating. But he was making the generalization, trying to get everybody to be on board with him, that it's
And yet the
obsolete.
questions that you're asking
I-
are implying that his...
I wasn't trying to persuade anybody. I was saying for
Are
me,
not accurate.
the
In
language
terms
is
of rhetoric,
obsolete.
in rhetoric, you were. You were trying to get people to agree that the conditions of that novel were no longer current, hence the novel itself did not resonate. And I think different people do read differently, and that's another aspect of naming and language conventions, that every reader has a right to read the book in the way that that reader reads the book.
The same reader reading the same book at different times will have different interpretations
true as well.
and
Right.
different
Yeah.
responses.
So what I'm gonna say is, at the time Burgess was writing the book, to use Russian language was really subversive, right? He was trying to poke at people to get a reaction from them by
Right.
using that language.
And that's
So
because
today,
we have
if they were going to
Russian-
rewrite that book, they'd do it in Farsi, or they'd do it in Arabic, or they would do it some other way
I
to
disagree
get that.
that there
to
is,
get that
there
same
is
response.
Russian in our culture. Russian
Oh,
is almost
no, absolutely,
totally
but it
absent
wouldn't.
from our culture.
But it wouldn't evoke the same reaction.
I think it would.
in the reader that today, that it would if you took another language that we would at this point provoke that same sort
I
of
think,
response.
given the
from
war in
United States.
Ukraine, I think that Russian is almost totally
Oh,
absent
sure,
in our
absolutely.
culture, and that we are at another point against that.
Oh
So
no,
we have to
I'm not
assuming
disagreeing
that-
with you. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that
But you're
the
assuming
general
that-
audience today
And you're
wouldn't
assuming
react to it the same
everyone-
way.
Everyone's
Well-
reaction today would be the same as it was
No,
in
I'm
the
not
70s.
saying that at all.
Because we have a conflict today that's regionalized.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm
You
saying
literally
that
just did it.
I
You said it
know.
would resonate today.
No, I'm saying that every reader reads a different book because of reader response. We don't all have the same responses because of our cultural upbringing or whatever, and our level of reading competency, and that, different people will say different things, and that's okay. That's all I'm saying, and that's what I've been saying right along. I'm saying not everybody has to agree that A Clockwork Orange is obsolete or that it doesn't speak to today. I just brought up that conflict because I think we have very little of Russia in our culture, and it is very subversive to bring up anything about Russia in this country, yes.
Question.
Actually, more of a statement. With your current naming of things in your books, what in your particular series of books was the thing that you found the most difficult to name?
commonly used things that have to be a little bit different. So, and again, it depends on the world that you're in. I actually found if we talk about language, I found it more difficult to come up with colloquialisms that were not current, but that would sound natural in that environment.
Say, like, for example, in Battlestar Galactica, people going frack.
Yeah, but that was just a convention.
That's
You knew what it was supposed to be,
yes.
and it's just more like if you live, say, you live your life in tunnels under the moon. What is going to be your colloquialism for, free and clear, for instance?
Right.
Free and clear means you're outside, you're going to die. So you've got to have, a different thing. I would bet my bottom dollar, well, they're not using dollars anymore, I'd bet my last can of air. Okay.
Right.
That implies the same thing with a different set of words. So that for me was the hard, I had to pay attention to that. Weaponry and stuff like that, I can call it pretty much whatever I want, and I just chose to go with whatever it did. It's a gun, it shoots things. And then I chose to, just like, in thrillers today, your Glock 17, well, okay, I've got a Wang 24, Just make up a name, but it's a trade name. It's a trade name that is consistent throughout the novel, so that that's a particular handgun as opposed to the long rifle.
But are handguns obsolete?
No.
In your stories? I mean,
No, actually,
science fiction?
So first, now we're going to get into what my world does. I firmly believe we're never going to have handheld lasers because the power to weight ratio will never work. We're still going to be shooting chemical projectiles.
Really.
You don't need air to make a chemical projectile work. Now, if you live in a pressure dome, you don't want a high power weapon. Okay? You want a spring-loaded needler that shoots deadly needles, not something that's going to go through a pressure hull and kill everybody.
Yeah.
Catherine,
Yes.
that question, I was curious what your answer was.
I've never really had a problem naming things because I love words and I love to, let's see, what do I want to convey with this? And what is the reader going to understand from what I'm calling this thing? And in my world, they don't say frack, they say void, referring to the void. That it communicates immediately, that this is a
bad thing.
A bad thing. and they don't talk about any god by name, they just say the divine. And so that would encompass everyone's. But I enjoy, I had to think of a name for a futuristic fighter jet. How about pterodon? Hey, that's a mean flying thing. It really. So I have fun with it. I have never really come to a situation where I didn't know what to call that.
But again, that's only if you're naming things in order to make them match the object. And there are other kinds of naming, and there are other meanings to names that
there are and
represent the people more than the names.
And in some situations where there was a societal situation where someone was trying to mislead, then they might name it something that was not obvious or did not convey what it does. But so far, I haven't written about one of those situations.
Well, there are things like naming pieces of swamp, paradise estates, and that goes on Mars and
Florida.
Iceland, Greenland.
If you're doing that in your book or story, it has a specific purpose.
That's right. Of course it does.
Jerry Purnell's got those books where one of the planets is named Haven. And
Yeah,
it's
Haven.
definitely not.
Or Down.
Falkenberg's Legion.
Yeah.
That whole series, there's like 3 or 4 planets that are very ironically named.
Whose book is Hell's Pavement? Anybody know that one? That's from the 50s, and I think it's not
I don't know. I what I've always loved about Cornell is the kind of shoot from the hip kind of naming.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, like, you know, we made it. Right? You know?
Oh, some of them are like that. Yeah, the
Yeah.
names of the planets or the cities are very.
Yeah.
Niven did that with We Made It, or the planet was called Jinx.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Let's let our friend at the back
Did
speak. Go
you
ahead.
guys ever start with a cool name and that built the story? Like I gotta write something around this because this is pretty cool.
I have built a story around a person's name. You know, I mean, Cleopatra Lee was an intentional choice.
Cool. Nice.
That's a cool name. Based on people that I knew and a certain set of things, and it's in its own way, kind of misleading. But yeah, I don't think I've ever written anything around a cool name. Maybe a place name, you know, but that's been done before.
Sure.
Like Paradise, which is definitely not.
Yeah, I try to choose names where I don't have to explain the name, unless, again, if there were a situation where that was the point, is that you didn't know what it was, and it wasn't until, you know, the big reveal that you find out that but mostly I'm just trying to communicate effectively with my readers by giving them names that they don't have to say,
Yeah, or that by using it,
yeah,
you immediately know what it
exactly,
is.
exactly. It's in context, you get it. I have so many words myself that when I see them in context, I know what they mean. Definition? No, I can't really tell you.
I'd struggle with that.
I have an e-reader. Let me just touch and let it give me a definition so I know this word I've been using for decades. It's like, oh, is that what it really means?
Right. Or the origin of the word, which is sometimes even more interesting.
Yeah, I love word origins too.
Since there's only a few minutes left, could you give a quick spiel about where you're going to be for the rest of the con?
Sure. I've got my schedule right here. Tomorrow I'll have an autograph session from noon to 1 in Autograph 2, and on Saturday, that is Saturday, tomorrow, Saturday, and then I'm not on another panel until 8 o'clock that night. Who is your hero really? So more writing stuff. And I'll be around if you want to catch me and chat a little bit. Love to.
And 9 a.m. tomorrow, for all those of you who are actually going to be up, I'll be talking with other people about researching your writing, a rabbit hole I've been down way too many times. Of course, we all now have the magic answer box that can tell us anything we want, anytime we want.
The research is
Well,
really
sometimes.
And then at 11, keeping it real, how to make fantasy worlds feel real, basically some world building in fantasy and I hope science fiction too. And then I've got a couple panels again on Sunday, and I'm always around, willing to talk to anybody.
Yeah, mingle with the guests. I'll be there.
Yeah.
Catch me there.
Well, I'm going to be at the autograph session at noon with the cartoons and things that I do in addition to the books that I've edited. And then at 1 p.m. in the same room, Is This Our Future? Mad Men and the Dopamine Rush, semantics about naming things and who's going to rule us in the world by the power of naming and so on. Don Draper and the Ad Men invented love. And we're going to do The Crystal Egg, which is a Zoom Players production on YouTube, and that will be shown at 3 p.m. tomorrow, H.G. Wells' The Crystal Egg. And then on Sunday, Creating Through the Challenges of the Change, Menopause, and Other Adversities. So, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Creative Play and Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, please check out D&D Journey of the 5th Edition and Ragnarok Enroll a Scion Hero to Ragnarok Story. Also, check out our Patreon page for more content and behind-the-scenes things, as well as joining us for a one-shot game or two.